Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Daf Yomi. To the millions watching on Zoom and the billions watching on YouTube, we welcome you all here this morning to page 135, Daf Kuf Lamed Hey of Masechet Shabbat. We have got barely anything left. We've only got a couple of weeks left on this Masechta. And just as a bit of a heads up, I notice that page 156, which would be in a few weeks' time, is only one daf away from the actual end of the Masechta. So we might discuss as to whether we want to do some kind of bumper session or whether we want to do maybe the final daf together, so that we're kind of putting an end together as a group to Masechet Shabbat. I wonder if after this we'll discuss that a little bit, because that's quite exciting to be able to do. It's only one daf, one page off being able to complete the book together. So be interesting to see if we can come up with a creative solution so that we feel like we've completed. Because if you remember the first page of Masechet Shabbat we were able to do together, I think it would be quite special if we're able to do the last page as well. But for today, we're on page 135. We are going to share the screen with you so that you can see it, and we are going to get this one underway. Give me a thumbs up if you can see the page. Good stuff. All right, so page 135, we're actually going to jump a little back to the beginning of page 134b, Kuf Lamed Daled Amud Bet, just because we'll be able to see the Mishnah that we are tackling in today's daf. So we are in a chapter that is talking about what can be done in terms of a bris milah, in terms of a circumcision on Shabbos. It's not so straightforward. On the one hand, we have a mitzvah. A baby turns 8 days old, and so we have to do a bris. And therefore, if a child is turning 8 days old on Shabbos, then we override the laws of Shabbos. We violate the laws of Shabbos in order that this child can be brought into the covenant of Abraham Avinu, so that we can do the mitzvah of Brit Milah on the right day. But any other child is not supposed to have their bris on Shabbos, is not supposed to have Shabbos violated in order to do the mitzvah. And so we've seen all kinds of different halachas with regards to what kind of preparations can be done on a Shabbos, what rules you're allowed to violate exactly in order to bring about the bris. And we've seen different people that might be excluded from being able to have their bris on Shabbos. So it's a very interesting topic and worthy of further delving into. But for now, let's have a look at the Mishnah for today. We are allowed to wash a baby on Shabbos, whether it is before the circumcision or whether it is after the circumcision. And you should do it by sprinkling water with your hand rather than a kli. This will have been discussed in the first part of the Gemara, which we're not going to see because it was yesterday's stuff. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says that you're allowed to wash a baby on the third day after his bris, if that third day falls on Shabbos, and that is because it is the most painful and very serious day in terms of the recovery of the child, and therefore one can violate Shabbos to be able to pacify, calm, clean the baby. And he brings us the evidence for this from the story of Shechem, when Reuven and Shimon circumcised all of the inhabitants of Shechem, and on the third day, when they were at their height of pain. So that's how we know that the third day is an extremely painful, dangerous time in terms of the bris milah. So the final clause of the Mishnah, which we will be turning to today, is the following: Safek va'andrigonus. What if you have a child with a safek? What if you have a child with a suffix? Now, what is this suffix? This suffix is exactly which month the child was born in. Now, I have to profess, I don't fully understand everything that gets implied over here, so you'll have to indulge me. And I think the premise that we have to understand is that the way in which they operated back then is different from the way that we operate now. So in terms of the suffix, the doubt of a child, which month they were born in, the implication seems to be like this. If a child was born in the 9th month, then they were considered to be a viable child, a viable birth. If a child was born in the 8th month of pregnancy, then that prematurity was extremely dangerous, I believe, back in the day. And therefore a child born in the 8th month was viewed as a non-viable child. The reason why I get so confused by this, I don't have such a problem with the dangers of prematurity in a time before hygienic medical practice. The reason why I have a problem with this is because, as far as I can recall, a child born in the 7th month is viewed as more viable as a child born in the 8th month. That is why, for me, there's a little bit of uncertainty around all of this and a little bit of confusion. But nonetheless, a child born in the 8th month who therefore has this doubt about his viability and his survival perspectives, that child, according to the Mishnah, should not be circumcised on Shabbos, meaning that we shouldn't violate Shabbos to be able to do his bris because of the uncertainty around his life, the severity of violating Shabbos, even to do a mitzvah. And so therefore that first position in the Mishnah does not allow for Mila for a suffix child on Shabbos. The androgonus, and an androgonus is somebody who has both simonim, both indications, both presentations of male and female genitalia. So because again there's an uncertainty around exactly which gender this child will be, the first position in the Mishnah is that you should not circumcise them on Shabbos. We're going to delve into it more in this Gemara. However, Rabbi Yehuda matir b'androgonus, but Rabbi Yehuda permits circumcision for somebody presenting with both male and female sexual organs. So, with that in mind, we can turn to today's daf and check out, to the best of our ability, what it is all trying to teach us. So, here we go. Sorry. There we go. We're going to start over here at the bottom of Kuf Lamed Daled Amud Bet 134b, quoting our Mishnah, suffix va'androgonus, the doubtful child, as well as the androgynous child, hermaphrodite, presenting with both sexual organs. Here we go with the Gemara. Tanu Rabbanan. The rabbis taught us. We have a pasuk with regards to bris milah that we are to cut off, that we are to circumcise arloso, his foreskin. So the fact that the pasuk says arloso, his foreskin, indicates the following: arloso vadai doche es haShabbos. Where you have a definite foreskin, then you should override Shabbos to be able to do that. But not only a definitive foreskin, but also his definitive foreskin. And so therefore, velos safek docher es Shabbos, and so a doubtful and uncertain foreskin, where we'll come to more details on that shortly. But an uncertain foreskin therefore would not be circumcised on Shabbos. And not only that, but orlaso vadai docher es Shabbos, a definite foreskin should push off Shabbos, velo androgonus docher es Shabbos, but not a androgonus foreskin, because there we can't say with absolute certainty that he is a he. When we say his foreskin, so we can't say with absolute certainty that he is a he. Rabbi Yehuda Omer androgonus docher es Shabbos va'anash kares. Rabbi Yehuda, as we saw before, says that it would push off Shabbos. Not only that, but it's such a severe thing to not give that child a circumcision that va'anash kares, that the punishment of kares for one who does not get a circumcision could be hanging over their heads. because it's very important that that all male children should be given a circumcision, and so therefore he views them as a definite male. Or loso vadais doches Shabbos, the definite foreskin should push off the laws of Shabbos, but not somebody born at twilight, meaning that we're not going to be sure come next Shabbos whether he is in day 7, day 8, day 9. We're not going to know exactly how old this child is. So if they are not definitely 8 days old, they shouldn't be breaking Shabbos, violating Shabbos to give that child a bris. Our lasso, the pasuk says, Varlasso, Shabbos, a definite foreskin, a definite child should be circumcised, but not a child who is born circumcised or presenting a sexual organ that looks like it is already circumcised. That child should not push off Shabbos in order to have his circumcision. Beis Shammai Omrim, Beis Shammai would say, for such a child born with no foreskin, Beis Shammai would say, nonetheless, it's going to be necessary to draw some blood as a symbolic gesture of entering into the bris, into entering into the covenant. Beis Hillel say it is not necessary. If he is born mauled, if he is born circumcised, there is no further procedure needed to bring that child into the bris of Avraham Avinu. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, Lo nechachu beis Shammai beis Hillel ad nolad kishehu maul shetzarach lahatif mimenu dam bris v'mnei she'orla kavu shehi. So what we're going to see now is trying to understand all of these different positions and what exactly people are arguing about. So Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel actually don't argue about any case other than a child who is born circumcised and whether or not you need to draw the blood. Sorry, they're not arguing about this. My apologies. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is saying they're not arguing about the need to draw blood for a circumcised child when they're born, because their orla, their foreskin, is not actually cut off, it's just suppressed, it's not visible. And therefore, they would all agree, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, that he does need to have some blood drawn. Says Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar then, Al-Man nachleku, where are they arguing? What are they arguing about? And so he answers, Al-Ger shniskaya kishehu ma. They're arguing about a convert who converts to Judaism, but he had already been circumcised as a non-Jewish child. In which case, Beis Shammai Omrim, Beis Shammai say tzarech lahatach mimenu dam bris, that you do need to draw some blood as a symbolic gesture into entering into the covenant. Beis Hillel Omrim, ein tzarech lahatach mimenu dam bris. Beis Hillel say that such a person would not need to draw blood to enter into the covenant. Omar Mar. Now let's take a look at some of the other things that we've been saying. We said earlier that a suffix, the circumcision, as it says here, of a halachically uncertain foreskin should not override Shabbos. Well, what's that coming to include? What are we uncertain about? So the Gemara answers, we're trying to include the following scenario brought in the following statement by the rabbis. So as I was saying before, a child born in the 7th month, he will be a viable pregnancy, a viable birth, and so therefore you should violate Shabbos to be able to give him a bris on the 8th day, assuming he is healthy enough to have his circumcision on the 8th day. One of the things that we've mentioned elsewhere is that we obviously want to try and aim for day 8, but as we'll be quite familiar with, any child that is not up for the cut on the day should not be circumcised on the 8th day. They should be circumcised whenever they are healthy enough. But nonetheless, in theory, a child born in the 7th month of pregnancy should be able to have his circumcision on day 8. But a child born in the 8th month should not violate Shabbos in order to circumcise him. Says the Gemara, Safek ben Shiva, Safek ben Shmona, ein mechalin ela Shabbos. But if we are in doubt as to whether this child was born in the 7th month or whether he was born in the 8th month, then we should not then we should not violate Shabbos. Ben Shmona harehu ke'even va'asu l'taltalo. Aval imo shrechem v'nikasom mipnei hasakana. So much so that the child born in the 8th month is viewed from a muktzah hilchot Shabbat point of view as a stone. Let's just scroll down a little bit. Because of his unviability, so in terms of being able to handle this child on Shabbos, and in particular to be able to give him a bris, he is viewed as a stone, which is muktzah to move on Shabbos. However, says the Gemara about imo shochem and nikasam mipnei hasakana. However, his mother may nurse the child and look after the child in order to avoid the danger. Although what I find remarkable about all of this is that the danger is more for the mother rather than for the child. Now, as I said, this has changed. If we look at Tosfos towards the bottom of the page, and I appreciate you can't see it if you're sharing my screen over here, but Tosfos does say on the first wide line regarding an 8th month child being viewed as a stone, Tosfos says, Nira Lari, the Re says, that Achshav Mutzah L'Talta Kol Tinokos She'ein Anu B'Kiyim, that all children are allowed to be moved because we're just not experts on this kind of thing. And so that does indicate that this has all changed as time has gone on. Again, I don't have the requisite background knowledge to understand the difference between 7 months, 8 months, 9 months, but interesting nonetheless that it's brought. This, by the way, I should have pointed out before, this is quite a challenging page to go through. So, here we go, continuing with the Gemara. Itmar, it was stated, Rav Amar, halacha katana kama. Rav says that the halacha is in accordance with the position of the Tana Kama, the first position. The first position going that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel would be agreeing about a child born circumcised, but disagreeing about a convert, and the halacha would be like Beis Hillel. So that's what Rav would tell us. Shmuel Amar halacha k'Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and Shmuel says that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, meaning that Beis Hillel and we got that wrong, Nick. Okay, so the first Tana, like the Tana Kama, would say that Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai are arguing over a child born circumcised, and then according to Beis Hillel, the child would not need the extra blood drawn. And Shmuel says that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, that the disagreement is over a convert, whether he needs to have blood drawn or not. Rav Ada bar Ahava, Isyalid Lehahu Yanuka Shehu Mahu. Rav Ada bar Ahava, his wife at least, gave birth to a child who presented as being circumcised already. Ahadre Atzleisa Maholai. He searched around, he spoke to 13 different Mohalim, and they all refused to circumcise the child on Shabbos because they held that one should not do so on Shabbos. Ad Shivaye, until he did it himself, and Karas Shivcha, and he ended up mutilating his child because he was insistent on circumcising on Shabbos, and he didn't do the job properly, and as a result of that, his child was mutilated. Omar, I did say it's a difficult one. Amar Tesi Lida Avriyadarav. So, where are we on the page here? So Rav Ada bar Ahava said, well, I deserved that because I violated the teaching of Rav. Rav who said that the halacha is like the Tana Kama, that if we have a child with a circumcised foreskin, then we should not be doing a Milah on Shabbos. Amalei Rav Nachman, Ada Shmuel Avar. Rav Nachman said to him, we've also gone over on the teaching of Shmuel. Eimar da Amash. Excuse me. Eimar da Amash Shmuel B'chol. So we can say that Shmuel's opinion was relevant to the weekday, but Shabbos miyama. But did he say so on Shabbos that one should not desecrate Shabbos? Who savar vadai orla kabushahi? Ravada ba'ahava, it would seem, held that in a case of a child presenting with a circumcised foreskin, it's not that there was no foreskin, it was just that it was concealed, it was just that it was suppressed. And that is why, according to Rav Ada bar Ahava, he felt that the circumcision should be performed on Shabbos. Because as Rabbi said, we are concerned that there is a concealed foreskin, and therefore there is uncertainty. Rav Yosef Amar Vadai Orla Kavushahi. Rav Yosef said it is certainly a concealed foreskin, and therefore it would have been permitted to circumcise on Shabbos. Amar Rav Yosef said, Minam Minala. How do I know this? Where am I getting my line of reasoning from? The Tanya, as it says in the Baraita, Rabbi Eliezer HaKafa Omer, Rabbi Eliezer HaKafa said, Lo nechlechu beis Shammai beis Hillel al nolad kishu mahu. They do not disagree. If a child is born circumcised, there is a need. There is a need to draw blood. What are they arguing about? They are arguing about whether one should violate Shabbos to be able to do this. Beis Shammai omrim mechalel in alavas Shabbos. Beis Shammai say that you should. Beis Hillel omrim ein mechalel in alavas Shabbos, and Beis Hillel say that you should not violate Shabbos to be able to do this. Lav nechlal Tana Kama Sava mechalel in alavas Shabbos. Does this not imply, therefore, that the Tana Kama, the first position, holds that everyone agrees that you should desecrate Shabbos to be able to do this? So the Gemara says, maybe what we're saying actually is that the Tana Kama's position is that everyone says you shouldn't violate Shabbos, which begs the question, okay, Rabbi Eliezer HaKafa, Tama Debeis Shammai Asana Shmeina. In which case, Rabbi Eliezer HaKafa is coming to introduce the opinion of Beis Shammai. So really, where we get to with this, the Gemara says that the proof is not absolute. Perhaps what we're saying is that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel do not disagree with regard to the issue of a child born circumcised, but rather they are disagreeing about the need to draw blood during the week, and that is what they're disagreeing about. So we're left in a very suspended place at the end of that piece of Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yassi. Rabbi Yassi says, Kol she'imot me'eleida nilu lishloim. Any mother who is impure, who becomes tamei on account of her birth, what we're going to see here is that we're meaning that she has had a natural birth which has rendered her impure, so such a child should be circumcised on the 8th day. Continues the Gemara, any mother who is not impure on account of the way she has given birth, then the child should not be circumcised on the 8th day. What do we mean by a mother who is not going to be impure on account of her birth? So we are talking about somebody who gives birth through a cesarean section. Their body has not undergone the same release, let's call it, as a woman giving birth naturally, and so that woman doesn't become Tumeah, according to what we're saying over here. So how does Rabbi Asi know that only a mother giving birth naturally, the child should be circumcised on the 8th day? Because Shnei Amar, as the verse says, Isha ki sazriya v'yalda zachar v'tama. As the verse says at the beginning of Parashas Tazriya, if a woman gives birth, the older Zachar gives birth to a male, she shall be impure. On the 8th day, that child should have his foreskin circumcised. Okay, so that was the evidence that Rabbi Asi had, that a woman who gives birth, i.e. gives birth normally to a male child and becomes impure, that child should be circumcised on day 8. Amalei Abaye says, Doros Harishonim Yochichu. Hold on, we're going to see that there were people giving birth in the generations before the giving of the Torah. They prove that a woman would not have become ritually impure, as the halacha did not exist before the giving of the Torah, and nevertheless, those children were circumcised on day 8 because that was given before the Torah. So that is evidence against the position of Rav Asi that someone born through a cesarean section should be nevertheless circumcised on day 8. turning the page, Amalei Nasna Torah v'nischadsha halacha, that the giving of the Torah brought about a new halacha. And so we can't say that just because it happened before the giving of the Torah that it should happen again after. The Torah now is changing that position. Gemara asks, is that the case? But we see a statement that with regards to a child born by cesarean or a child born with two foreskins, Rav Huna Barav Chia Barav, there's a disagreement between Rav Huna and Rav Chia Barav. One says that you should violate Shabbos, and one says you shouldn't violate Shabbos. So we're seeing here that it's not so clear cut. Excuse the pun. So they're only disagreeing with regards to whether or not it's permissible to violate Shabbos. But they're not disagreeing as to whether the child should be circumcised on day 8. Meaning that if that was an issue, then our argument would have been arguing about that as well. But they all clearly agree that a child born by caesarean section gets circumcised on day 8. And it's not... therefore, it's incongruous with what Rav Asi was saying just before we turned the page. So continues the Gemara Habahatalia. The two arguments are interdependent, meaning that the one who says that we should break Shabbos for the bris also holds that he should be circumcised on day 8, and the one who holds that you should not desecrate Shabbos would also say, therefore, that the child should not be circumcised on day 8. Now we're going to see over here a precedent for this understanding of children not needing to be circumcised on day 8. Kitanai. It's like the following machlokes. Yesh yilid bayis shenim olecha. And as I said, this is difficult concepts that we are dealing with, especially for 2020. So further research and reading is, of course, always recommended. Yesh yilid bayis shenim olecha. The yesh yilid bayis shenim oleshmona. What is a yilid bayis? A yilid bayis is somebody who is born into your household through the ownership of a slave. So a child could be born to a master's house, which requires his circumcision to be performed on the first day, and there is a child born to a master's house who requires his circumcision to be done on the 8th day. Yesh miknas kesef shenimul le'echad v'yesh miknas kesef shenimul le'shmona. There are instances of a slave bought as or purchased as part of a transaction where that child needs to be circumcised on day 1 of his life, and a purchased slave who needs to be circumcised on the 8th day of his life. Yesh miknas kesef shenimul le'echad v'yesh miknas kesef shenimul le'shmona. So what we just said, a purchased slave who needs to be circumcised on day 1, day 8, ketzad. What is the case? So the Gemara answers for us. Lakach shivcha me'uveres. A person purchases a pregnant slave. So the master now owns that pregnant slave and will own anything that comes from that pregnant slave. So va'achakach yalda, and afterwards the woman gives birth. Zehu miknas kesef hanim l'shmona. That is an example of a purchased slave who needs to be circumcised on the 8th day because the master owned the slave already at the time of birth. Lakach shivcha v'vlada ima. But if he purchases a slave along with her newborn child, zuhi miknas kesef shenimul le'echad, then actually the child would need to be circumcised instantly, even if he was only a day old, because he has been bought separately, as it were, purchased separately along with the mother, and therefore instantly enters into the master's house, instantly therefore would need to be circumcised. This
is a Jewish maidservant.
This is a
because is it a Jewish maidservant?
I'm not sure that it is.
It says here in Marley Canaanite maidservants.
Yeah.
So Canaanite, is that reference to a Jewish or non-Jewish?
I believe it's a reference to a non-Jewish.
Right.
Because we have Eved Ivri, which is a Jewish.
In which case the child is not Jewish.
But they would nonetheless assume a Jewish identity while being in the ownership of a Jewish master, if I'm not mistaken.
Interesting.
There's other halachas that becomes relevant to with such things as feeding. If a kohen owns slaves, being able to feed their slaves teruma, right, which a non-kohen cannot eat, but anyone under his household, I believe, would be able to eat from his teruma.
But the assumption here is that effectively a non-Jewish child is circumcised in accordance with the Jewish tradition, which is obviously it's a biggie.
Yes.
Okay.
At the time, it's only a lily, but
okay.
And that joke is now on YouTube forever. Okay, so but yes, I believe that is what we're saying. Okay, so where are we? So yesh yelid bais shenim or l'shmona. So what is going to be the case? What is going to be the case of a yelid bais, a child born to the master's house who gets circumcised on day 8? Lakach shivcha, purchase a slave, v'nis abra, she becomes pregnant, etzla, becomes pregnant while in his house, v'yalda, and she gives birth. Zehu yelid bais hanim or l'shmona. So that is going to be a child who gets circumcised on day 8. Rav Chama Omer, Rav Chama says, Yalda va'achar kach hitzbila, if she gives birth, va'achar kach hitzbila, and afterwards she goes to the mikveh to become Jewish. That's why, by the way, I was saying that it's talking about somebody who's not Jewish, is because she now, in this instance, is going to the mikveh to become Jewish. Zehu yelid bais shenimu le'echad. This is going to be an example of a child who becomes Jewish through the mother and gets circumcised on... or does he become Jewish through the mother? Okay, we'll ignore that I said that. But nonetheless, it's going to be a homeborn child who gets circumcised on day 1. But, hitzbila va'achar kach yalda. Yes, I'm sorry, he doesn't become Jewish necessarily through the mother. His ownership through the master means that he gets circumcised on day 1. But but if she immerses, becomes Jewish before she gives birth, that is going to be an example of a homeborn child who requires circumcision on day 8, because he would have already become Jewish through his mother's conversion pre-birth. But Tanakama, lo shani le bein hitzbila v'achar kach yalda, bein yalda v'achar kach hitzbila. But the first Tana, the Tanakama, does not distinguish whether she immersed first or second, before or after the child being born. Because he says the Tanakama says there's no difference, and even though the child's birth does not make the mother impure when she gives birth, because she's not obligated in mitzvahs before she went to the mikveh, and so she does not have, and this is why it becomes relevant to what we were saying. So she's not becoming impure due to the childbirth. She's not obligated in mitzvahs before she's gone to the mikveh, and therefore, and nonetheless, we're seeing that the child is being circumcised on day 8. That was why it was being brought, because what we saw was that you can have an instance of somebody who is not subject to the rules of ritual and purity, and nonetheless the child is being circumcised on day 8. So now we see the following: Amarava, which gets bracketed out in the Gemara, but Bishlam al Rav Chama. This works according to Rav Chama. Mishkachas yatla Yelid Bayis Nimol Le'echad, because you can understand the scenario of a Yelid Bayis, a child born at home that is circumcised on day 1, and Yelid Bayis Nimol Le'shmona, and a Yelid Bayis who is circumcised on day 8. Not only that, but we've got a scenario for a Miknas Kesef Nimol Le'echad. We've got a purchased slave and the child being circumcised on day 1, and we've got a purchased child being circumcised on day 8. We've seen those scenarios. If she gives birth and afterwards immerses, that is the child who gets circumcised on day 1. If she goes to the mikveh first and then gives birth, that's a child who gets circumcised on day 8. Miknas Kesef Nimol Lishmona. A purchased child is going to be circumcised on day 8. If the slave was purchased while she was pregnant, then went to the mikveh, and then gives birth, that's Miknas Kesef who gets circumcised on day 8. Miknas Kesef Nimol Echad. What's the case of a purchased slave getting circumcised on day 1? If we purchase, one second. No, I'm not in the right place. That is going to be where the maid servant had already given birth, and you had purchased the fetus. You purchased the child separately, as it were, as a separate transaction, so to speak. And I hate using such words, but there we go. It's what we've got in front of us. So in such an instance, the child is going to be circumcised on day 1. So that all works according to Rabbi Chama. But if we are trying to understand the position of the Tama Kama, I can understand all of these scenarios, with the exception of the Yelid Bayis, who is being circumcised on day 1. What is that scenario over there? Because if we remember what we just said, is that it doesn't matter if the woman went to the mikveh first or second. It doesn't make a difference. That child is going to be circumcised on day 8, according to the Tanna Kama. So what is the case according to the Tanna Kama? Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah says, it is where the maidservant has only been purchased because the master wanted the rights to the child. And that is why he was purchasing the maidservant, and that is why that child born would be circumcised on day 1. That would work according to the opinion that kinyan peirus lavka kinyan haguftani, that the acquisition of the products of the things that you own, the products of the transaction, is not the same as the transaction of the actual guf, the actual body, the actual item. Meaning that the fruits can be viewed as separate to the item that is being purchased, to the entity that is being purchased. But what's going to be said then, according to the opinion, that purchasing the products of a transaction comes under the same purchase as the entity itself, meaning that anything that the shivcha gives birth to is going to be included in this deal. Amar Rav Mishashia b'lokeach shivcha amanas shelo lehidvila. So Rav Mishashia interprets this to be understanding that we're talking about a purchase of a shivcha where the intention has been that she should not immerse and not take on any Jewishness about her, and therefore the child born to such a shivcha is going to require circumcision immediately. That's where we're going to leave it for today. As I said, it opens up a whole need for further research, further understanding, further discussion. But for the purpose of our recording today, that's where we're going to leave it for. We wish everybody a meaningful and wonderful day. I'll take questions once the recording has stopped, and thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again.